Up next on Book TV's Afterwards, University of Virginia history professor Sarah Milov discusses the political history of tobacco in America. She's interviewed by former FDA Commissioner David Kessler. Afterwards is a weekly interview program with relevant guest hosts interviewing top nonfiction authors about their latest work. All Afterwards programs are also available as podcasts.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Your book is a major accomplishment. It is a significant scholarly work. I think it's fair to say you move the field.
Oh, well, that's a tremendous thing to hear coming from you, David. Thank you so much.
How does it feel?
Like a big relief, you know. It's been 10 years in the works to make this book, and so it feels like a relief, and it's just a pleasure to be able to talk about it with you and tons of other interesting people.
3 major writers spent their careers studying, writing about tobacco and the cigarette. Richard Kluger won the Pulitzer Prize for Ashes to Ashes.
Amazing book, cinematic, like really a page turner.
Alan Brandt, the great medical scientific historian on the cigarette century, and Robert Proctor at Stanford about the deception of the industry. Any trepidation when you started? I mean, you had 3 literally giant books.
They are giant, yes.
Out there, and you took a risk.
Yes, but you know, I really feel as though with those 3 books, Ashes to Ashes, Cigarette Century, and Robert Proctor's whole corpus of works, the biggest of which is called Golden Holocaust. I really feel as though I was standing on the shoulders of giants. These are fantastic works, and my work is tremendously indebted to them. But when I was thinking about writing about tobacco, I wasn't approaching it the same way that they were. They were very much coming at the story of tobacco from the angle of industry. And when I began this project in a much more humble state, just as a lowly graduate student, I really began it from thinking about agriculture and farmers, which it's probably not surprising to say there aren't 3 humongous tomes about tobacco agriculture. And so I actually saw these big works as a reason for my little opening wedge into the field to write about it in a different way. And then, of course, the book and the project changed quite a bit in the past 10 years from when I began this, these many years ago.
Let's just start with a basic question. How does Professor Sarah Milov, how do you view the cigarette?
Well, I think returning back to those 3 works that you mentioned, and returning to how we think about the cigarette in popular culture and political life, we very much tend to associate the product, rightly so, with the deception of the major tobacco firms. Now, it has a cinematic quality to it. The executives of tobacco firms met in the Plaza Hotel in a chilly December night in 1953, and they hatched a plan to basically engage in what became a half-century-long conspiracy to manufacture doubt as a way to evade regulation. This is a tremendously important story, and one that I think has been, is continuing to be fruitfully mined to apply to other strategies of corporate deception. But if you take a wider angled view, what begins to come in focus is what the presence of the cigarette in American life was not simply produced by the industry itself. If you begin with from seed to smoke, you see that the government, the federal government specifically, has had a really big hand in abetting the cigarette century, to use Alan Brandt's phrase. And what undermined the presence of the cigarette in American life was not the fact that the feds finally got hip in 1964 or the 1990s. It was the assiduous efforts of activists in the 60s and 70s to really dislodge the hold of tobacco in American life, and they couldn't do it by operating at the federal level. They had to look to local and state governments to do so. So if you think about the cigarette, over the span of the 20th century, you see a product that was, and a behavior pattern, a culture, a way of life that was made by federal action and that was unmade by a social movement that basically created a new character in America, the character of the non-smoker.
We're going to spend a lot of time talking, unpacking that.
Yes.
Let's just start. How does Professor Milov, how do you do history? How do you do history?
Oh, I love this question. Well, I think, what you're trained to do in graduate school is read as much as possible that's been written and try to, the first couple years of graduate school are to kind of poke holes in every book that you read and think about what's missing or what kind of analysis do they put forward, but what does that kind of paper over and hide? And the whole point of asking these questions and being so hard on these important, fabulous tomes is so that the graduate student basically figures out what their own voice can be, what their own contribution to novel research can be. And so when I was reading in graduate school, I actually wasn't steeped in the tobacco debates at all. I was very interested in an entirely different question about the persistence of regionalism and regional economies and regional difference. And so at the beginning of my time in graduate school, there was a lively debate amongst historians of the South and historians of conservatism over the question, is the South still a unique region? This was, the 2000 and aughts, So did it make sense to focus on the South as a region that was different from, say, the Sun Belt? Because a lot of historians looked at political life out in the suburbs of Atlanta, in the suburbs of Charlotte, in the suburbs of Phoenix, and Los Angeles, and they said, the patterns, the political patterns that are happening here look the same, and so maybe the South isn't really the central point of regional distinctiveness is not what's really operative anymore. And so in my reading and in my quest for novelty, I was interested in the persistence of Southern agriculture and the persistence of an agricultural economy, even in a region that began to look over in the post-war period, even in a region that began to look more like other parts of the United States. So I was kind of pushing back against this idea that the South was, just like the rest of the United States by saying, well, if you focus on this way that that money is made in the South, the political economy of the South, well, you might actually start to see a continuity in between, regional distinction in the 19th and early 20th century, to the late 20th century.
I saw there was a fellowship you had around 2010. Mm-hmm. I guess it was the Virginia Historical Society. You're at the University of Virginia. The cigarette. You're not from the South. You've lived, Florida, Massachusetts. Yes. Is there something geographically about Virginia, about the land, the cigarette?
Yeah, so, just going back deep into my own reading and my own history, I thought that some of the literature on Southern distinctiveness maybe gave a bit of short shrift to the persistence of basically agricultural myths, that the presence of undeveloped land in the South, or what appeared to be undeveloped land in the South, had a cultural hold on people, and land is also, an important feature of Southern agricultural economy. And so it was very much a quest to understand the meaning of land in a post-World War II South that gave rise to this project, because I was thinking, what are the two crops that are most associated, that are most grown in the South? Of course, there's cotton and there's tobacco. And it seemed to me that tobacco was a much more interesting commodity to focus on in the 20th century.
If my historical research is right, I mean, I can trace your interest back to a McDonald's. You're in North Carolina. You're waiting for a Billy Jurgen.
Yes.
Take me back to the early interest.
Yes. So it's so funny that you mentioned that. So when I was beginning this project, I had decided I'm going to try to understand how tobacco farmers related to big tobacco. That was my original question. And to do that, I knew I'd need to look in archives across North Carolina. And I selected North Carolina as kind of this case study because North Carolina was and is the leading producer of a particular kind of tobacco called flue-cured tobacco that is a primary constituent in an American-style cigarette. And so I knew I'd need to set up camp and do research at UNC, at Duke, at North Carolina State, at East Carolina University in Greenville and the Coastal Plain. But it would be very helpful, and I would recommend this to any young historian who's thinking about beginning a book, a dissertation, or a book project, to find a local source that's a bit of a history buff. And this gentleman had been involved with the tobacco economy. He had worked for tobacco, basically a state-level tobacco lobby, and he had produced a self-published book. And people who produce self-published books are usually very happy to talk to you about their research. So I just emailed him out of the blue and said, I'm a graduate student. I'd love to talk to you about your work in tobacco. And he was more than happy to meet with me. And he gave me a lot of information I otherwise wouldn't have known, and wouldn't have known where to look had it not been for meeting him. Yes.
So the interest was in agriculture. Mm-hmm. It was in the South. Mm-hmm. It was in tobacco. Where did it start? I can't trace it back to your undergraduate days. Where did the idea come from? Your parents are docs, right?
Yes. This did not come from smoking. I can say that.
In fact, the beginning of the book, is really about tobacco before you really get into the cigarette. Mm-hmm. Is that
absolutely?
So
yeah.
It wasn't the cigarette. It wasn't the health.
Right.
It was. Were you always a political historian? Was it the?
Yeah, I was really interested in. So, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a tremendous tension between the big tobacco of the era, which was then known as the Tobacco Trust. And the Tobacco Trust was the monopoly controlled by James B. Duke of Duke University fame. And what Duke did beginning in the 1890s was he basically bought up every type of tobacco concern around. He consolidated hundreds of smaller tobacco companies into one big company called the American Tobacco Company. And because the American Tobacco Company had essentially monopoly power, it meant that American tobacco could dictate prices that it would pay to tobacco farmers for what they grew. And so there was tension, there was violence, there was anger on the part of tobacco farmers toward this big monopoly.
Give me a sense of, the tobacco farmer. Who was the tobacco farmer?
Mm-hmm. So tobacco farmers for the late 19th and early part of the 20th century tended to be small. They grew on a small scale, and in part that was due to the fact of the crop's tremendous labor requirements. The crop was colloquially known as the 13-month crop because planning for the subsequent season had to begin even before the current season was harvested. It relied on, there are different stratums within tobacco farming. So you had landowners who may work the farms themselves with family labor, or they may have hired tenants or sharecroppers. And there's a racial dimension to this. Tenant farmers were more frequently white. Sharecroppers were more frequently African American. And the difference between those two was that sharecroppers, sometimes never saw cash in the course of what they did. They had to buy from the store where their debts were, tallied against what they brought in from the previous season. So it was a perpetual cycle of indebtedness. And so even for the top of this class system amongst tobacco farmers, they were always so much weaker relative to, of course, something like the Duke Tobacco Trust. So you see even amongst elite farmers anger at the big tobacco of its day. And so what motivated me toward thinking about tobacco through the latter part of the 20th century was, my question was essentially, what happened to all of that antagonism within the industry once tobacco and cigarettes begin to be threatened from the health perspective? Did that outside threat foment an alliance between farmers and industry where before there had been antagonism? And so that was kind of the quest that I was on.
And this movement from this angry opposition to a business-like alliance, did it occur?
To a large extent, it did occur. But it did not occur because tobacco farmers thought that the cigarette manufacturers were their friends. So what happened that changed everything in American agriculture, in Southern agriculture especially, but in American agriculture writ large, was the Great Depression, but more importantly, the New Deal. And the New Deal was tremendously consequential for tobacco because it instituted a very rigid and very controlled system of regulations on the land. So when you think, tobacco is just this unregulated crop, in fact, more than any other crop grown in the United States, tobacco farmers had to abide by very strict production controls. And in fact, tobacco farm laws were not written with the main part of the Farm Bill. They were always written separately with their own legislation. So what the New Deal did was basically institute a system of, think of it as supply management, that we're going to make sure that Mr. Tobacco Farmer, who, by the way, you cannot just declare yourself a tobacco farmer. You essentially have to have a license to grow.
An allotment.
An allotment, exactly. That Mr. Tobacco Farmer cannot produce more than X amount, and this is going to be revised based on yearly projections for what the manufacturers need. But in exchange, we'll provide Mr. Tobacco Farmer with a minimum price for the tobacco. It's kind of akin to a minimum wage in industry, and it was passed at right around the same time. So what this did was it basically enabled the agricultural sector to be kind of buffered from what you can almost think of as the bullying of the tobacco industry.
True for wheat and corn and tobacco, or differences?
The major difference with tobacco is that the program of supply management was much more rigid. That there was not buffers within the agricultural law to allow people to go way over 1 year and then underplant the next year. You simply were not allowed to market over your allotment.
You talk about the phrase iron triangle. What is that?
Well, an iron triangle is an old political science term that basically refers to an alliance between, or a dynamic between a subcommittee in Congress that oversees a regulatory agency and private industry. So, say the tobacco subcommittee, the USDA, and tobacco farmers, organized tobacco farmers. And the most important tobacco farm organization for the cigarette, for much of the story I tell, is the North Carolina Farm Bureau.
And so give me a sense of this iron triangle, the 50s or so. What's the dynamics there?
So the basic story with what's going on in terms of tobacco farming after, say, World War II is that tobacco farmers are very empowered by Congress and encouraged by the USDA to basically write their own laws. So what do I mean by this? Well, after war, any producing group is anxious about readjusting production to peacetime. You know, you're not going to have the same kind of revved up industry that you would have during war. And there's a special reason to think about that with cigarettes because, of course, the armed services were such important purveyors of cigarettes. So after the First World War, farmers were not organized. They had not been corralled by the New Deal. And they experienced a really severe depression, and all farmers did in agriculture for a lot of the 1920s. And so during the Second World War, tobacco farmers who have now become more organized by their interaction with the federal government, and the federal government is literally organizing groups of farmers into committees so that they kind of plan how much tobacco they'll produce in subsequent years. So these elite tobacco farmers are coming together in various places across North Carolina, and they're saying, you know, what are we going to do about the post-war readjustment? We can't let what happened after the First World War happen again after the Second World War. And so what do tobacco farmers have now that they didn't have after World War I? What they have now is proximity to government, proximity to the levers of power. They have a whole bureaucracy.
These are the farmers and their proximity to government.
They have a whole bureaucracy that's interested in their well-being in a way that they had not been before.
Because of votes? Because of money?
Because, you know, the New Deal did, well, I'd say for two reasons. One, the New Deal did, you know, inaugurate a way of doing government that gave power and benefits to privileged groups. And in this case, it was producers, tobacco farmers. And you can see this to a lesser extent, perhaps a less successful extent, but also to organized labor. There was a theory of how the economy should work, that if you could get producers to essentially form organizations to get their house in order, you could have more smooth functioning of the economy overall. But the second reason that tobacco becomes so strangely important had to do with the power, really, of Southern Democrats, right? Like, who's important in the New Deal coalition? Who's the glue that holds these disparate, you know, northeastern farm groups or northeastern industry groups together with Southern farmers? It's Southern Democrats, and so they've kind of wield outsized power in terms of the Democratic Party.
Now, it's the farmers who had the power, or was it the corporations, the tobacco corporations?
You know, tobacco corporations have power this whole time, right? What is new is the interest of the federal government in shoring up farmers as well, in producing policy that ensures that farmers have a standard of living that they had not been assured before.
Who's driving who? You talk about the federal government having interest. Is that because the companies had interest? Is that because the tobacco farmers had power and they stimulated the interest of the government?
Well, I think there's like a political calculation on the part of Southern Democrats that, you know, they've got these constituents that are important. You know, they have many more constituents that are farmers than they had constituents that were tobacco executives.
So this is about votes?
In part, it's about votes, but in part, it's about kind of an economic theory about how to empower different groups in the modern economy. That if you had an imbalance between the agricultural sector and the industrial sector and the consumer sector, then that might lead to another depression. And so it was important for the federal government to basically shore up these different groups of Americans and make sure that there was kind of economic harmony.
Let me give a simplistic assertion that tobacco really was never good for the farmers. It was good for the big corporations.
Well, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around that with what I know about the experience of tobacco farming in the 20th century. So because of federal policy that was directing money toward farmers, farming became a lot better. Was it perhaps many people at the same time, to your point, left the farm when they could, but the experience of farming post-1930s was much better than it had been pre-1930s. And tobacco farmers did, relative to corporations, relative to big tobacco, they captured a larger share of the price of a cigarette than they did before the 1930s, and indeed than they did after the end of the federal tobacco program in 2004.
And then something happens in the 1950s. It's called science. It's called health, leading up to the 1964 Surgeon General's report. So these farmers get caught completely off guard.
So because federal policy has encouraged the organization of some elite tobacco farmers, the industry sees an opening to make an alliance with tobacco farmers during, well, the 1950s through, arguably, the present day. And so at that cinematic meeting in the New York Plaza Hotel in 1953, it's not just the tobacco corporate executives. It's not just the executives of, you know, Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds that are there. There are representatives of tobacco agricultural groups there as well. And as part of the organizations spawned by Big Tobacco's conspiracy to doubtmonger.
The Big Tobacco being the corporation.
Yes. So
the farmers are...
They organize an agricultural offshoot of the Big Tobacco conspiracy. They organize a group called the Tobacco Growers Information Committee in the early 1950s that's intended to basically translate industry propaganda for an agricultural audience with the idea that farmers, who are this constituency beloved by politicians, important to politicians because they're more numerous, of course, than people who work for big corporations, that farmers may be, in fact, a very down-home ally for the big tobacco companies as they, try to make arguments against regulation on the basis of health.
So by the 1950s, 1960s, you have, 2, 3 different regimes, certainly from government. You have now government, Department of Agriculture, Congressional Appropriations Committee, the Agricultural Committee, supporting the industry, right? Yes. Wanting to help the farmer.
Yeah, and organizing farmers to go testify in Congress against people in public health. So, part of it is using farmers who are organized to basically be the mouthpiece of industry because they're more credible or more likable, sure. Down home than a suit from Philip Morris. So you see farmers going to testify against proposed cigarette regulations in the 1960s, for example.
And who was using them?
What do you mean? Was
it the industry? Was this the corporate, Philip Morris's of the world? Yes. Putting the farmers up to them? Yeah. They were happy to have these farmers out there?
The industry was very happy to have this alliance, but farmers, too, were not just pawns in this game. Farmers, too, were, they believed that regulation on health grounds would be bad for them. They had seen that their prosperity had been linked to, obviously, the rise of the cigarette in a really direct way. Also, many people might not realize that prior to really World War II, prior to the late 1930s, the main way that people consumed tobacco was not even in a cigarette. So the rise of the cigarette directly tracks the rise of prosperity for farmers, though the prosperity for farmers was due to demand, but it was also due to government interventions. So they were invested in people continuing to smoke.
Any disconnect in their heads? Did they want their kids to smoke?
I don't. Tobacco farmers smoked more than other people, and to this day, you see greater rates of tobacco use in tobacco growing regions. So I think, probably by the 80s, they didn't want their kids to smoke.
And so 64, you had the Surgeon General. You also chronicle the book shifts a little, right? You have the rise of the public interest movement.
Yes. So the Surgeon General's report comes out in 1964, and it's basically the first time the federal government says, smoking causes cancer and heart disease. And for many Americans, this is a huge event. It's splashed across the front pages on newspapers across the country. But, it had been in the works for a couple of years. In 1962, the Royal College of Physicians, basically the UK's equivalent to the Surgeon General, comes out with this report. With their report saying much the same thing. And so the question for Congress and for regulators, too, becomes, all right, what are we going to do with this information? Because the report basically said that, government needed to do something with haste on the issue. And so the FTC says, all right, we're going to use this, the Federal Trade Commission, as an opportunity to kind of enhance the power of our agency to regulate on this most important of health.
Enhance the power of our agency?
I know. Well, it's an opportunity for them to approach regulation in a new way, to approach regulation in a more muscular kind of way than they had before.
This wasn't about public health to them?
Oh, of course it was ultimately about public health, but basically the Surgeon General's report gave them the cover and an impetus to do something that regulators on that committee had said they had wanted to do before. So it was absolutely about public health for the FTC, but this was an opportunity to say we're crafting these regulations, which were proposed to be warning labels, in response to this report in the name of public health.
And as you chronicle the Hill didn't like that.
The Hill did not like that. So it turns out that Southern Democrats continued to be very powerful in mid-1960s Washington. And so in response to kind of more strongly worded warning labels proposed by the FTC, Congress steps in and they do what becomes characteristic of Congress acting at the behest of the tobacco industry, and they offer up a watered-down warning label, and they also basically say, hey, FTC, you can't regulate on this for a few more years.
They're fronting for big tobacco?
Oh, yes, absolutely. They have, yes.
Big tobacco pulling the strings?
Yes.
My sense is the book goes to a whole different level about this time, because you start telling the story of Donna Shimp, right, from Salem, New Jersey.
Yes. So part of what's at play with the warning label issue is the paradigm of consent, right? If we put a warning label on a pack of cigarettes, it is the smoker's choice to do what he or she will with that information. Now, by the late 1960s, early 1970s, a number of Americans are begin to think that, this consent paradigm makes no sense. And not for the reasons that become nonsensical later, the addiction issue, but the paradigm of consent makes no sense because most Americans, and this is true of even at America's smokiest, never experienced smoking as smokers. They experienced it as non-smokers. And so what becomes critical in the 1970s is the invention of the idea, the creation of the idea of non-smokers' rights.
You go back to the early 1900s. Was it Dr. Charles Peace, New York subways? I think there was an op-ed in the New York Times that opposed any restrictions on smoking back at the turn of the prior century. People were comfortable. The Times said, let people smoke in subway cars. So the non-smokers' rights. What was different in the 1970s than the early 1900s?
Yeah, so the idea of a movement for smoking restriction had an antecedent in the early 20th century. So it might surprise a lot of people to know that, a handful of states actually banned the sale of cigarettes in the early 20th century. It was it was basically a kind of cigarette version of prohibition.
But if you didn't have the modern cigarette,
no.
People rolled their own cigarettes, and somewhat you had the inverse, right? I mean, in the early 1900s, of course, smokers were fighting for their rights to smoke because most people didn't smoke at the turn of the previous century.
Right. Most people did not smoke at the turn of the previous century. And here's the link to the temperance movement, the prohibition movement. The people that did smoke at the turn of the 20th century tended to be immigrants. They tended to live in cities. They tended to be young men. They tended to be portrayed as juvenile delinquents. So smoking at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, was considered something almost un-American. It was a vice of the foreign-born. And so the anti-smoking movement of the first 2 decades of the 20th century kind of rode a wave of nativism and thinking about, what type of behavior is appropriate for, native-born, healthy Americans.
Go back 1970 to Donna Shimp. Tell me about her. Tell me about her case.
So Donna Shimp was this fascinating woman. So she was a customer service representative working for New Jersey Bell, and she had a terrible tobacco allergy. And where she worked in New Jersey, more than half of her coworkers smoked, which was actually a more smoking environment than most people's offices, because at this time, only about 40% of the American population smoked. So she was exposed to smoke on a daily basis, and she had complained to her supervisors and had not gotten very far, and it really affected her quality of life. Every day, she would pop an antiemetic pill because she would throw up sometimes, and she began to wear a gas mask to work, which to me just...
At the telephone company.
Yes, she had to lower it, but she did not remove it completely when she spoke with people on the phone or when she spoke with people who came in to the office.
This was the little bells before we had Verizon.
Exactly, yes. This is AT&T, yes. So she, went to she was a member of the Communication Workers of America, and she went to her union steward and she said, this is a workplace health issue. Can you help me? Throughout the meeting, he is smoking, which must have given her an indication of how she would not get very far in talking to him. She went to the company doctor. This is a big company, so she went to the company doctor, and the company doctor said, this is ridiculous. Like, you're ill. Your workplace is making you ill. You need to stay home until the company works out an arrangement so that you can, return to work in a safe and healthy environment. And so she says, okay, she tells her supervisors, and she thinks she'll just be home a couple days until they rejigger the office to accommodate her. Days turn into months, which in her mind, there must have been alarm bells going off. What the heck is going on? Are they planning to fire me? Am I going to lose my job? Why are they so devoted to this smoking office? And so while she's at home, she's basically on a sabbatical. And as an academic, I understand that by being on sabbatical, she actually gets some work done. And she basically immerses herself in the burgeoning world of anti-tobacco activism. So she makes contact with a group called ASH, Action on Smoking and Health, which was the legal arm of the anti-tobacco movement. She contacts a local social movement called GASP, Group Against Smoking Pollution. And from these sources, she basically learns that she's in uncharted territory, that there are no state, to say nothing of federal laws, that govern the presence or absence or regulation of smoking at work. And so she basically realizes that the only way that this will get resolved is to pursue legal action. And so she decides she's going to sue her employer. And that's also a really daunting thing to consider. She's in totally uncharted territory here.
The duty to have a safe workplace, where did that legal theory come from?
I think that it's a very well-established common law idea about the responsibility of an employer to an employee. What was novel was that smoking constituted an unsafe work environment for Donna Schempp.
Legal innovation?
Yes.
Judicial activism?
Legal innovation married to a judge's understanding of science and the need of the worker. So Donna Schempp's case takes on this tremendous kind of almost in the world of public health celebrity dimension. So, it's 1975, she's going to sue her employer. She doesn't really know where to turn. And back before the days of Wikipedia, she did what any kind of motivated, informed citizen would do. She calls up a reference librarian at Rutgers to ask, who should I talk to if I want to talk to somebody about this? What is there anybody working at the law school? And this is what historians call contingency, the idea that if this one little thing could have been different, maybe history as a whole would have been different. And so it just so happened, so this is the contingent event, that a law professor by the name of Alfred Blumrosen was on faculty. He was teaching at Rutgers Law. And Blumrosen had spent the previous decade serving in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was the federal agency created to enforce the Civil Rights Act at work. And so Bloom-Rosen had thought a lot about the responsibility of employers to not discriminate on, various axes. And he was teaching a class in employment law, and he was eager to take up her case pro bono and use it as a teaching tool for his students. And to me, that's just amazing, because Bloom-Rosen was the kind of figure that, thought a lot about the relationship between agencies and lawyers. Sometimes agencies, in fact, want to be sued so that they can, fulfill their mandate.
He was the legal architect?
For the Shimp case, he was crucial in preparing the initial documents. Yes.
I have a sense you were captured. You were enormously interested in her.
So she did so much work on her own. I mean, I just think about what it would have taken to be her in this work environment that's, it's a hostile work environment. She is throwing up from smoke, and people are smoking in her face, right? Like, her employer doesn't want her there. While she's at home, making these phone calls, she also drafts, a very extensive suggestion for a corporate policy that she delivers to the headquarters of AT&T about how they could reasonably accommodate non-smoking employees. And a line that ends up being very consequential in her case was that, if you can have a non-smoking section for the operators at the switchboard, you clearly have the power to tell employees not to smoke in certain areas. So
she died early this year. Mm-hmm. Did you interview her?
No, I wanted to talk to her, and I reached out, but I did not hear back. She was, pretty aged.
She left her papers at the University of California. Were they helpful?
Tremendously. Yes, and so I'm glad that you noticed that I seemed captivated by her, because I really was. So in the course of this document that she's written to AT&T, she also pioneers what becomes an important argument through the rest of the 70s and in the 80s, where she says, smokers are expensive employees. They take breaks, they destroy equipment, they are sick more often, and she basically presents a business case for restricting, and then later it becomes taken up as banning tobacco at work. And although this was not the point that the judge who ruled in her favor picked up upon, it becomes an important argument that she makes later on as she continues anti-tobacco advocacy.
She won her case, mm-hmm. but there was limited precedent. Other jurisdictions did not
side with non-smoking employees, no.
Did that make a difference? Was it really about the law, the case? What was the difference here?
Yeah, so that's such a good question. So there are some other cases that spring up in the late 70s and early 80s where employees are basically making similar types of claims, and they don't succeed. What I think made the difference, or what made the difference overall to the anti-tobacco movement as it proceeded through the next decades, was this business case. So Donna Shemp, and here's another reason I was so captivated by her, she continued to work at Bell while also, post this case, while also basically starting her own business, her own consultancy that she ran out of her basement. And her consultancy basically made the case to businesses that it would be good for your bottom line to protect non-smokers at work. And her argument was basically twofold. One, smokers were expensive employees. And two, hey, look at my case, you're creating potential liabilities. Now that part was a little fudgy because, her case was rather unique. But the idea that, this is an inexpensive way to potentially save money for employers ends up being very attractive to businesses that take up smoking restrictions through the with increasing speed in the 1980s.
My sense is you circle, the book is, about rights, rights of the smoker, rights of the non-smoker, the right to make a living. So these are political rights, these are legal rights. How do you think about it?
I think about rights talk as being increasingly salient for non-smokers in the post-1960s era. It's a way of communicating their claims that really had not existed prior to the 1960s. And I think that for non-smokers, this rights talk is really coming from three sources. One is the influence, of course, of the civil rights movement. And non-smokers' rights groups like GASP, Group Against Smokers' Pollution, they're these decentralized advocacy groups all over the country. In their literature and in speeches made by organizers, they sometimes stretch the analogy between claiming non-smokers' rights and participating in the African American freedom movement. They stretch this a bit far, but they say things along the lines of, is there really any difference between asking for the right to sit at a lunch counter and the right to sit at a lunch counter and enjoy one's lunch? Is there any difference between what we're asking for and what African Americans were demanding in the 1950s and 1960s? So there's kind of they borrow the moral heft of the civil rights movement. The second kind of stream of thought that I think is really shaping the rights talk of non-smokers is like the feminist movement, specifically the idea of consciousness raising. So for non-smoker advocates, one thing they have to do is make it safe to say, I'm a non-smoker, and I think that how I want to be in this space should determine what the space is like. They have to basically make people realize that make non-smokers realize that they share a common experience together, a common experience of being oppressed, if you will, by the presence of tobacco smoke. And so there's some borrowing of the idea of feminist consciousness raising, that by sharing a private indignity with other women, that you can basically make that into a public claim. And the final strand of thought that's informing the rights talk is the environmental movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s, as non-smokers' rights activists, framed indoor smoking as an environmental hazard.
Does the book have a hypothesis? Did you start with an hypothesis? Did you start with a thesis?
No. To return to our earlier conversation, I just started with a question, which was, what happened to the antagonism between tobacco farmers and the tobacco industry as both became threatened by knowledge that smoking caused cancer? So I started with a question, not with an answer.
I've heard you say the following. What ultimately reduced tobacco's grip on American society was not the discovery that smoking causes cancer, and of course the Surgeon General's warning to that effect. It was the invention by activists of non-smokers' rights. The idea that people who do not smoke were entitled and able to achieve unpolluted air in shared public spaces.
I stand by it.
Can I push back a little?
Yes.
I see the history of tobacco as one of chapters.
Mm-hmm.
When I came to Washington in 1990, there was a lot of progress on secondhand smoke. We finally were able to get on planes and not breathe polluted air. But there was, quote, the industry used this word, I always sort of shuddered, accommodation that was made.
Yep.
Right? That's what they wanted to talk about, accommodation. But the issue had somewhat plateaued. right? And the progress of the anti-tobacco community, they were sort of, they were a little bit at a loss. Mm-hmm. I mean, when we started looking at a different question of whether nicotine was a drug, we focused on, was the industry manipulating nicotine levels to keep people smoking? Right. Then we focused on kids. Right. So I see these as chapters. You see this as the key determinant.
I agree that there's chapters. I think what my book suggests is that an important chapter that we've overlooked was the rise of a true social movement around the idea of non-smokers. And that chapter perhaps enabled the subsequent chapters.
Absolutely. I mean, that rings very true to me. So what's the implications? If you're right, that my rights as a non-smoker to non-polluted air, that doesn't portend well on the vaping issue, because at least for now, the vaping industry says, well, there isn't secondhand consequences. We'll see. But that's not then the same kind of tool that's available, right?
Yeah, the vaping issue is different than the tobacco issue, though. To return to the idea of tobacco unfolding in chapters, we're at a chapter where we can look back over the whole of the past 100 years and ask, well, what do we know? And I think one thing that we know is that we should not take the tobacco industry at its word, and we should not assume that just because we don't have proof of, the harmful consequences, deep proof of, the epidemiological consequences of vaping right now, or secondhand vaping right now, that there wouldn't be. But I think also that what this history suggests is that social movements, can really make a difference. And if that social movement is around the idea of secondhand smoke, or if that social movement is around the idea that Juul shouldn't market to kids, that can be an impetus for action. And what my story also shows is that action doesn't have to be at the federal level to be meaningful. And so, activists can try to implement laws at the local level or at the state level. And those had tremendous success in the history of the cigarette at changing attitudes toward the presence of tobacco smoke in society at large.
How did the cover come about?
The cover is the property of Harvard University Press.
Talk about, in the moment or two left, the tobacco as a model for taking on big, hard, challenging societal issues. Climate change?
I do see lessons in this that, maybe I'm just an optimist, but, not that many people read about tobacco and feel optimistic. So what I think a key takeaway of this book is that the federal government for a lot of the 20th century has been organized around the interests of industry and producers. And you can see that with climate change. You can see that with tobacco. You might be able to see that with guns as well. But laws aren't just made by the federal government. And so one lesson of anti-tobacco activists is the power of local laws to change the way people experience their day-to-day lives. So by achieving scores of victories at the local level in the 80s and 90s, anti-tobacco activists made more non-smokers and a bigger constituency for the kind of future they wanted to see. And I think that there's lesson in that for climate change activists that might, say, be frustrated at federal inaction.
Guns?
There, too. One trademark of the anti-tobacco movement was kind of a visual vernacular. Thank you for not smoking. I've noticed in more places that I've been to, signs that say no guns on these premises. And I wonder if that visual vernacular, just raising awareness of the presence or absence of guns in a place, can make people more aware of their stance on an issue.
I want to thank someone, Dr. Cynthia Gwen Yautis, who's Associate Editor of the Journal of American History, for helping me prepare for today's interview, I have one last question. You love doing history?
Absolutely. I have my dream job. I love researching, and most days I also love writing.
And you did it very, very well.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
Congratulations. A major, major scholarly achievement.
Thank you so much. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.